In a room where money set the rules and silence held more power than words, Ava Thompson sat with one goal: to reclaim her great-grandfather's desk, the last tangible piece of her family's history. She had prepared for this moment, ready to outbid anyone in the hall. But as the auctioneer's chant filled the air, her raised paddle was ignored once, twice, then again. The bids climbed, the desk slipped further away, and a quiet injustice unfolded in plain sight. What happened next would pull Ava into a fight far bigger than an heirloom one that would shake the walls of an untouchable industry. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The soft hum of voices filled the auction hall, blending with the faint clinking of champagne flutes and the rustle of silk gowns. It smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume, a space built to impress and to remind anyone who walked through its doors that money ruled here. Marble floors gleamed under the glow of crystal chandeliers suspended high above, each one scattering light across the crowd in sharp, glittering fragments. The air itself seemed curated cool, controlled, with a weight to it that warned you to speak softly and move with intention. Rows of gold-trimmed chairs faced a raised platform draped in deep burgundy fabric. On the far wall, towering mirrors reflected the guests back at themselves, a quiet reminder of the exclusivity of this world. In one corner, a pianist played something light and unobtrusive, notes floating in the air without ever daring to compete with the hum of conversation. Staff in tailored black moved silently through the aisles, offering trays of sparkling wine to anyone who signaled. Ava Thompson sat near the middle of the third row, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The crowd around her was dressed like they had stepped straight out of glossy magazine spreads, designer suits, diamonds at ears and wrists, silks that caught the light every time someone shifted in their seat. Ava's dress was simple, understated, deep navy with a single strand of pearls at her throat. It wasn't the flashiest in the room, but it was deliberate. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to win. Her gaze wasn't on the glittering chandeliers or the murmuring clusters of guests. It was locked on the stage, on the oak podium, where the auctioneer was leafing through his notes, rehearsing his rhythm with a subtle flick of his hands. Beyond him, resting on a stand beneath, a spotlight was the item she had come for. It was a desk, solid, hand-carved, the kind of craftsmanship that whispered of another time. The wood had a warm, deep hue, polished to a soft sheen, but showing the faint marks of age and history. To anyone else in the room, it was just a piece of antique furniture. To Ava, it was blood and bone. She knew every curve in the carved legs, every swirl in the wood grain, because she had seen sketches of it in old family photographs. Her great-grandfather had built that desk himself, back when his shop on the south side was still standing, before the fire, before the debts, before it vanished from the family without a trace. She remembered her grandmother's stories told in the quiet of the kitchen late at night, how the desk had a hidden compartment only family knew about, how it held letters and ledgers from a time when the shop's success meant they could keep food on the table even when the rest of the block was struggling. To see it here, under a spotlight in this room, stripped from that history and reduced to a luxury collectible, made her jaw tighten. The people around her chatted lightly, their conversations drifting in and out of her focus. A man in an Italian suit was explaining to his companion that the desk style suggested early 20th century craftsmanship, possibly French influence. Ava kept her face neutral. She knew the truth, that it had been made by American hands, in a neighborhood most of these people wouldn't drive through, even in daylight. She checked her bidder's paddle, resting it on her thigh, the number facing down. She had done her homework, learned the auction process, and set her limit, knew exactly how far she could go. But for her, this wasn't just a transaction. This was reclaiming a piece of her family's story, one that had been taken from them and swallowed by a system that treated their loss as opportunity. The auctioneer cleared his throat, and the room's energy shifted, conversations quieted. All eyes turned toward the stage. 37, he announced, his voice rich and practiced. An exceptional example of early 20th century craftsmanship, provenance confirmed, preserved in excellent condition. The words rolled off his tongue like poetry, but Ava heard none of it. She heard her grandmother's voice instead, whispering that some things are worth more than money, worth more than pride. Ava straightened in her seat, her pulse steady. Around her, bidders adjusted in their chairs, ready to lift their paddles at the first call. She wasn't intimidated. She had walked into this room knowing she didn't belong in their eyes, but belonging wasn't her goal. Winning was. The auctioneer began the opening bid, numbers climbing quickly as hands shot up around the room. Ava waited, letting the rhythm settle, her eyes never leaving the desk. When the moment was right, she would move. And when she did, she intended to make it count. The burgundy curtain behind the auctioneer shifted as two attendants stepped forward, careful and deliberate, carrying the desk into view as though it were made of glass. The lighting above shifted. A warm spotlight angling down to bathe the wood in a glow that brought out the depth of its color. A ripple of appreciation moved through the crowd's soft murmurs, a few raised brows. The polite hum of people impressed by the craftsmanship but detached from its story. Ava felt the air change inside her chest. It was the same sensation she had when she stumbled across the first photograph of it years ago, tucked inside one of her grandmother's old albums. She had stared at that faded picture for what felt like ours, tracing the lines of the carved legs, the way the drawers curved inward, the subtle floral motif along the edge. In the photograph, her great-grandfather stood beside it. Younger than she had ever pictured him, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, a proud but modest smile on his face. He had built that desk with his own hands in his workshop, a shop that didn't exist anymore, the lot now a weed-filled gap between two boarded-up buildings. The auctioneer began his description, speaking of exquisite detailing and period authenticity as though they were secrets only he could decode. He spoke of its rarity, its exceptional condition, and its verified provenance. But not once did he speak the name of the man who had made it.
Not once
did he acknowledge the hands that had shaped it, polished it, carved it, until it became a piece worth admiring. To him, it was an object. To Ava, it was a heartbeat. Remembered the last time her grandmother spoke about it. She had been only 16 then, sitting at the kitchen table while her grandmother, tired and small in her chair, told her how it had been taken. Not in one sudden theft, but in a slow unraveling of circumstances. A fire in the shop, an insurance company that refused to pay debts that piled too quickly. The desk had been sold to cover costs only. It wasn't really a sale. The buyer was a man who offered pennies on the dollar, a man who knew desperation when he saw it. From there, it disappeared. No records, no trail, just gone, till now. Ava's fingers curled around the bidding paddle in her lap. It wasn't just about sentiment. It was about reclaiming what had been stripped from her family, piece by piece, until only the stories remained. She had spent months preparing for this moment, researching the auction process, quietly tracing the desk's path through private collections, and saving every dollar she could to make sure she came here ready. The auctioneer gestured toward one of the attendants, who pulled open a drawer on the right side of the desk. The crowd leaned forward to watch as he revealed the craftsmanship within, the smooth dovetail joints, the pristine lining. Ava's heart thudded harder. That drawer was ordinary. It was the compartment behind it that mattered, the hidden space her great-grandfather had designed himself, where he kept letters, contracts, sometimes even wages, until he could take them home. She doubted anyone in this room knew it existed. A couple in the front row whispered to each other, their eyes scanning the desk like they were already imagining it in their study. A man in the back tapped his phone, probably checking auction records or deciding his ceiling bid. None of them knew what it meant to her. None of them cared. Ava's eyes stayed fixed on the desk, even as the auctioneer's words washed over her. Her pulse was steady, but her grip on the paddle tightened until her knuckles ached. I wasn't sure if she was holding it because she was ready to bid, or because it grounded her, reminded her she was here, in this room, fighting to take back something that had been lost long before she was born. The auctioneer named the opening bid, his tone crisp and confident, scanning the crowd for the first sign of movement. Around her, paddles began to rise, measured and deliberate. Ava waited. Patience had been the key in her plan. Let the first flurry of bids play out. Let the price climb into the range where serious contenders revealed themselves. Then she would step in. She drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of her grandmother's stories settle across her shoulders. This desk wasn't just wood and craftsmanship. It was history. It was proof. It was a reminder that her family had once built things meant to last, things worth preserving. And she wasn't about to let it slip through her hands again. The bidding started briskly, the auctioneer's voice carrying with a practiced rhythm that made each number sound like an invitation and a challenge all at once. 10,000? Do I hear 10? Yes. 12 now. Thank you. 14. His gaze swept over the crowd, sharp and selective, scanning for the slightest twitch of movement, the lift of a hand, the flick of a paddle. Ava sat poised in her seat, the paddle resting lightly between her fingers. She had counted the moments, tracking the rise in price, waiting until the initial flurry of hands settled. The early bids came from the overconfident, the ones who wanted to stake their claim loudly and early. She preferred precision. At 18,000, the rhythm slowed, the auctioneer drawing out his pauses to coax more from the room. Ava lifted her paddle smoothly, her number angled toward him in a way that left no doubt she was entering the fray. He looked past her. His eyes slid over the third row entirely, locking instead on a man 2 rows ahead and to the right. Silver hair, tailored navy suit, the kind of bidder who was greeted with a nod and an easy "thank you, sir," before the price jumped to 20. Ava kept her paddle raised for an extra beat, certain it had been a simple oversight, but he didn't correct himself. He didn't ask if there were other bids. He simply moved on, his voice rolling to the next number as though she'd never made a move at all. A low current of murmurs shifted behind her. It's a kind of sound that could be mistaken for idle conversation, but wasn't. She caught the flick of a glance from a woman in the row behind Sharp. Knowing, gone in an instant. Ava lowered her paddle, her expression calm, though she felt the faint tightening of muscle in her jaw. She told herself to breathe. One missed acknowledgement could be explained. Auctioneers were fast. They scanned crowds quickly. Their attention was constantly moving. She had seen it before, people overlooked, misread, skipped in the whirlwind of numbers. But this didn't feel like a whirlwind. It felt deliberate. The price climbed again. 22, 24, 26. Ava raised her paddle once. More steady, deliberate, making sure the motion was visible not just to the auctioneer, but to the people seated nearby. She held it high enough that the light caught on the glossy surface of the number card. The auctioneer's gaze reached her raw load for a fraction of a second, and then moved on. Called on another bidder, a man across the aisle in a cream-colored blazer who had been glancing at his phone only seconds before. "Thank you, sir. 28. Do I hear 30? This time Ava didn't lower her paddle immediately. She kept it raised until the weight of holding it became noticeable, until she felt the subtle shift of attention from a few seats away. The woman behind her leaned slightly to the side, as if confirming what she thought she'd seen, that Ava was bidding and being ignored. Finally, Ava lowered her arm, resting the paddle across her lap. Her expression was neutral, her breathing slow, but inside, something had shifted. She could feel the familiar low burn in her chest, the one she got when someone tried to write her out of a moment she had earned her place in. She'd had it in boardrooms before, in business negotiations, even in restaurants where her presence was treated like an inconvenience. It was the quiet insult of being invisible in plain sight. The auctioneer was back to his rhythm, coaxing. 32 from the silver-haired man in front, urging 34 from the man in the cream blazer. Laughter from a corner table drifted through the room as a couple in evening wear whispered to each other about where the desk might fit in their summer home. None of them noticed or pretended not to notice that a bidder in the third row had been erased from the process entirely. Ava kept her posture steady, eyes forward, hands folded loosely over the paddle. There was no value in showing her irritation. She could play the long game. If he thought she would shrink back, disappear into the polite silence of the crowd, he was wrong. For now, she let the numbers climb without her. But each call he made without acknowledging her was a notch she remembered, a tally she was keeping. In the back of her mind, because if there was one thing Ava knew about being underestimated, it was that the best way to dismantle it wasn't with noise. It was by making your move when no one expected it, and making it count. She shifted her gaze to the desk under the spotlight, its polished surface gleaming as the bidding edged higher. This wasn't overwrought by a long shot. The auctioneer's chant carried through the hall, smooth and unbroken, his voice curling. Around each number, like a ribbon. The bidding had slowed again, hesitating at 38,000. Ava could feel the pause in the air, the way the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the next raise. This time, she wasn't going to give him the slightest excuse to overlook her. She lifted her paddle sharply, the motion deliberate, the glossy card catching the light. 40, she called, her voice cutting clearly through the hum of the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes swept past her again without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement. 40,000, thank you, sir, he said, gesturing toward the silver-haired man in the second row. The man gave a lazy nod, as if granting the price out of mild amusement rather than intent to win. For a moment, Ava kept her paddle raised, certain the mistake would correct itself. But the auctioneer had already moved on, coaxing. 42,000 from another bidder across the aisle. The crowd shifted in its seats. The sound that followed wasn't just idle conversation anymore. It was the distinct murmur of people who had noticed something, were deciding whether to speak on it or look away. She lowered her paddle slowly, her fingers tightening on the handle until the edges dug into her palm. There was no heat of embarrassment in her chest, only the cold clarity of recognition. This wasn't an oversight. This was a choice. He was deliberately bypassing her. In the row behind her, a man coughed, the sound too abrupt to be natural. Someone else leaned toward their companion, whispering low. Ava could feel the eyes on her, some cautious, some curious, a few tinged with that subtle mix of pity and detachment. That said, I see what's happening, but it's not my problem. She kept her chin high, staring straight at the auctioneer as if daring him to meet her gaze. He didn't. His focus flitted instead to bidders whose suits matched the tone of the room, whose faces were familiar in this circle, the kind of bidders who fit seamlessly into the image an auction house wanted to present in its highlight reel. The desk remained under the warm halo of the spotlight, its polished surface reflecting just enough of the light to give it depth. It seemed impossibly small, dwarfed by the weight of the room's collective wealth and the unspoken rules guiding who was heard and who wasn't. Ava's great-grandfather had built that desk with the kind of skill that couldn't be bought at any price in this hall lent, yet here she was, having to fight simply to be acknowledged as a contender for it. Another bid came in 44,000 from a man Ava hadn't seen move until the auctioneer called on him. The chant continued without pause, the rhythm unbroken. Round her, a few people still cast sidelong glances, and one older woman near the aisle shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressing into a thin line. But no one said a word. Ava's breathing was steady, but she could feel the undercurrent of anger coiling tighter inside her. She knew this game. She had lived it in boardrooms where her ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them, in client meetings where she had been spoken over and then expected to smile through it. It was the kind of dismissal that came with a casual ease, because the person delivering it knew they could. The auctioneer called for 46,000, his voice bright and coaxing, paddles lifted. He didn't look in her direction once. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression unreadable. She could have raised her voice again, forced. The issue made it impossible for him to ignore her without exposing his bias to the entire room. But she knew what that would cost her. Hear how quickly the story would shift from the auctioneer ignored a bidder to a bidder disrupted the process. She had no interest in being painted as a problem before she had the chance to act on her own terms. The murmurs faded as the numbers climbed, absorbed into the relentless flow of the auctioneer's chant. Ava kept her focus on the desk, her mind turning over the reality that had just crystallized. He wasn't going to call on her, not once. Not unless she found a way to make bypassing her impossible. This wasn't about a bidding war anymore. This was about being erased in plain sight. And she had no intention of letting that stand. The auctioneer's chant quickened, feeding off the energy in the room. The numbers climbed in smooth, practiced increments, each call of a new figure. Drawing another flick of a paddle from somewhere in the crowd. 48, 50, 52. The rhythm was intoxicating for some, but Ava heard it for what it was. Door slamming in her face, again and again, with every number called. She sat with her paddle resting in her lap, though her hand never released it. The weight of it against her fingers was a reminder that she was ready, that she could still jump in at any second. The price was climbing, but it was nowhere near the ceiling she had set for herself. She had planned for this, had worked out exactly how far she could go without compromising the rest of her finances. Oh, the desk was within reach. But the man on stage never looked her way, not once. His gaze swept the front rows, lingered on the familiar faces in tailored suits, paused just long enough on the occasional phone bidder's proxy before moving on. Ava could have waved her paddle in the air until her arm went numb and he would have found someone else to call on. At 56,000, a slim woman near the center raised her number card, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. The auctioneer nodded with warmth, his tone taking on that extra layer of appreciation reserved for preferred bidders. 58 came from the silver-haired man in the second row, followed immediately by 60 from the man in the cream blazer. Ava could see the pattern and unspoken rotation. Between a select few, the desk passed back and forth among them as though the rest of the room didn't exist. She shifted slightly in her chair, leaning just enough to scan the crowd. Most people weren't paying attention to her now. Their eyes were locked on the stage, caught in the rising pace of the bids, but a few still noticed. A man 2 seats down gave her the smallest shake of his head, like he'd already decided she didn't stand a chance. Behind her, the older woman who'd watched earlier now stared fixedly at her program, avoiding any further eye contact. Ava tightened her grip on the paddle. She could feel her jaw set, the muscle clenching just under her ear. And this wasn't about whether she could afford the desk anymore. This was about being locked out on purpose, stripped of even the basic acknowledgement that she was here and prepared to play by the same rules as everyone else. 62, 64. The auctioneer's voice carried the thrill of the chase. Though it was only a chase between the people he'd chosen, Ava raised her paddle once more, high and deliberate, holding it there longer than necessary. She knew it wouldn't matter, but she refused to let herself sink into the invisibility he was trying to wrap around her. The auctioneer didn't so much as glance in her direction. 66,000, thank you, sir, he said, nodding to the man in the cream blazer. The man smirked slightly, tapping the side of his card against his thigh. Ava lowered her arm. The paddle felt heavier now, as though it had absorbed every slight, every skipped acknowledgement. The bidding reached 70,000, then 72. The silver-haired man lifted his card again, but the woman near the center answered instantly. With 74, they went back and forth like that, and Ava watched with the sharp, controlled focus of someone memorizing every detail for later. When the final call came, going once, going twice, sold. The gavel cracked against the podium with a sharp finality. The auctioneer's smile widened as he announced the winning bid, 1,000 to a representative of an out-town developer. Polite applause followed, the kind that was more ritual than celebration. The developer's proxy stood briefly to confirm, then sat again. Already flipping through the next pages of the auction catalog, as though the desk were nothing more than another asset to add to their collection, Ava's eyes returned to the desk under the spotlight. In a few minutes it would be wheeled off stage, packed into a crate, shipped to some sterile office lobby or luxury condo project. No one in that chain would know or care what it had once meant to her, what it still meant to the family who had lost it. She exhaled slowly, her jaw still tight. She didn't clap. She didn't move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crowd was thinning when Ava rose from her seat. The chandeliers still cast their golden light over the room, but the hum of anticipation had shifted into the softer, more fragmented noise of post-auction chatter. Guests clustered in small groups, comparing purchases, arranging payments, and exchanging the kind of empty pleasantries that came so easily to people who always expected to be welcomed here. On the stage, the auctioneer was gathering his papers. chatting briefly with a staff member who was already boxing up the next lot for transport. His smile was still firmly in place, though it had softened now that the performance was over. From a distance, he could have passed for a man genuinely pleased with the day's results. Ava knew better. She stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking against the marble, and closed the space between them with measured strides. He noticed her approach when she was only a few feet away. The smile didn't falter, but it changed just slightly, becoming the kind of polite acknowledgement reserved for someone who didn't quite belong. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone courteous but cool, his eyes already flicking past her towards someone else waiting to speak with him. "You skipped my bid," Ava said plainly. No preamble, no pleasantries. She wanted to hear his answer without giving him space to maneuver around it. His brows lifted, the picture of mild surprise. "Did I? My apologies if I missed it. Things move rather quickly up there." "They do," she allowed, "but I raised my paddle twice. Once in the middle of the bidding, once near the end. He looked right past me both times." He made a small sound halfway between a chuckle and a sigh, as though she had just confirmed a minor inconvenience. "Well, it's possible I didn't. See it clearly. Lighting, angle, lots of people in the room. These things happen." Ava held his gaze, refusing to let him smooth the moment over with practiced excuses. "They happen to everyone?" she asked, her voice steady. Something flickered. In his eyes, a calculation. He adjusted his cufflinks before replying, "To be frank, Ms. Thompson. To be frank, Ms. Thompson, you seemed very interested in that piece. But the bidding moved quickly, and sometimes it's better to avoid putting someone in a position they might regret." Her brows drew together, just slightly. "What exactly does that mean?" He leaned in a fraction, lowering his voice in a way that might have seemed conspiratorial to anyone watching. "You wouldn't have been able to keep up anyway." The words were delivered softly, almost kindly, but they landed with the weight of a slap. Ava didn't move, didn't let her expression betray the heat rising in her chest. "You don't know that," she said evenly. His smile took on the faintest edge. "I've been doing this a long time. I have a sense for these things. The desk went for 78,000. It's not a small sum." Ava let the silence stretch for a beat, watching him try to read her. She could see he expected her to back down, to accept his assessment, and retreat with her dignity intact. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. "And it never occurred to you that I might have planned for that I might have come here prepared." Spread his hands in a mock gesture of helplessness. "The auction's over, Miss Thompson. The piece has been sold. I'm sorry if you feel slighted, but there's nothing more to be done." It was meant to be final, a dismissal wrapped in civility. But Ava heard the truth under it. There had never been a version of the sale where her bid was going to count. She could see it now in the way his eyes slid away from hers, the way his voice softened just enough to avoid confrontation while still holding its place of authority. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice level. "You're right about one thing," she said. "There's nothing more to be done here." He gave a small nod, clearly taking her words as surrender. Before turning to greet the next guest, waiting for his attention, Ava stepped back, but not before letting her gaze linger on him for one last moment. She wanted him to feel it, the quiet certainty that she wasn't walking away because she'd been put in her place. She was walking away because she'd just decided this wasn't the end of the conversation. By the time she reached the door, her jaw was set, her mind already moving past the sting of dismissal and into the territory of what came next. If he thought she'd let this go, he'd just made a very expensive mistake. The air outside the auction hall was cooler than she expected, the evening breeze carrying a faint trace of rain. Ava stepped onto the granite steps, her heels clicking sharply, each one a small release of the frustration she had been holding inside since the gavel came down. She had no interest in lingering. She wanted the distance, the space to breathe without the weight of that room pressing down on her. She had made it halfway down the steps when a voice called from behind her, not loud, but certain enough too. "Halter, Miss Thompson?" She turned, wary. A man was descending the steps at an unhurried pace, his hands loosely in the pockets of a charcoal gray overcoat. He was tall, mid-50s perhaps, with silver hair combed neatly back and a pair of glasses perched low on his nose. His expression was measured, the kind that suggested he weighed every word before speaking. "Yes," she said, her tone polite but guarded. He came to a stop a few feet away, giving her space. "Julian Pierce," he said, extending a hand. "I collect primarily 19th and 20th century American works. I was in the back row during the auction." Assia hesitated before shaking his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "All right," she said cautiously, "and I couldn't help but notice what happened in there." His eyes held hers steadily. With the desk, with the auctioneer, her jaw tightened before she could stop it. "Noticed what?" "That you bid twice 3 times if you count the moment before the final call and he skipped you every time," Julian said. There was no hesitation in his tone, no hint of question. That wasn't oversight. That was intentional. Ava studied him for a beat, searching for any sign this was just polite sympathy dressed up as concern. "And you know that how?" His mouth curved slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Because I've seen him do it before." I made her pause. "To who?" "Anyone who doesn't fit his idea of a serious bidder," Julian replied. "And believe me, that's not just about finances. I've watched him pass over women, young collectors," and he gave her a knowing look. "People of color. You're not the first to be shut out, and unless someone forces the issue, you won't be the last." Ava crossed her arms, the edge in her voice sharpening. "And you've just been watching this?" "Not just watching," Julian said evenly. "I've documented a few incidents, pushed complaints through the channels. They get buried. This auction house has deep pockets and deeper connections.
Nice.
The people they cater to are happy to look the other way if it means the right items. Land in the right hands." His words sank in, heavy but not surprising. She'd felt it in the room, those invisible lines that divided who mattered and who didn't. Still, hearing someone else name it with such bluntness stirred something, steadier in her than anger. "So why tell me?" she asked. "What do you think I'm going to do with this information?" Julian tilted his head, as though measuring her resolve. "Because I saw your face when the gavel came down. Not someone who lets things go. And frankly, I think you have more of a shot at rattling their cage than I do." She raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "I'm already part of their world," he said simply. "I know the rules they play by, but I'm also bound by them." "You're not. That gives you freedom I don't have." Ava glanced away toward the street, the city's traffic murmuring in the distance. "Freedom's not much without leverage." Julian's faint smile returned. "Then maybe it's time to find some. If you want it, I can help you trace where that desk is headed. And I can put you in touch with someone who's been looking into the auction house for a while now." She studied him again, searching for the angle. There was always an angle. But what she saw instead was a man who seemed tired. Not of her, but of watching the same injustice repeat itself without consequence. "I'll think about it," she said at last. Julian nodded, as if he'd expected nothing more. "That's all I ask." He took a step back, preparing to leave. Then paused. "For what it's worth, Miss Thompson, you handled yourself well in there. Better than most." She didn't answer, just gave him a small nod before turning toward the street. The desk was gone for now, but this conversation had shifted something. She had walked out ready to let the anger settle and fade. Now she wasn't sure she wanted it to. They walked side by side along the quiet stretch of sidewalk, the glow from the auction house fading behind them. The streetlights here were softer, casting long, pale shadows that made the night feel calmer than it was. Julian kept his hands in his coat pockets, his voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond the space between them. He said, "What happened in there?" "You might have legal grounds." Ava glanced at him, skeptical. "For what? Hurt feelings?" "For discriminatory practices," Julian replied. "An auctioneer who refuses to recognize a legitimate bid because of bias, that's more than unprofessional. It's potentially actionable, especially if there's a pattern. Patterns are easy to deny when everyone looking at them benefits from the way things are," Ava said.
Ava.
She kept her pace steady, her eyes on the uneven cracks in the sidewalk. "You said yourself. You've complained before, and nothing happened."
Oh.
"That's true," he admitted, "but your case is different. It happened in full view of a room full of people. More than a few saw it. Sure, she said dryly. And half of them will swear they didn't. Julian didn't argue that point. Even so, if you wanted to pursue it, I know attorneys who specialize in cases like this. They'd take it on. Ava slowed her steps and turned to face him. Let's say I do that. Best case scenario, they get fined. Maybe the auctioneer gets a slap on the wrist, and a few people in that room feel momentarily uncomfortable before they go right back to their lives. That's not what I want. He studied her, as if trying to read the undercurrent in her tone. Then what do you want? I want that desk back, she said without hesitation. And I don't just want it handed over in some quiet settlement where they can pretend this never happened. I want people to know exactly how they operate, how they decide who's serious enough to be heard and who isn't. Julian's brow furrowed slightly. You're talking about making this public? Very public, I'm talking about. Exposing the system that lets them get away with it, Ava said. 'Cause if it wasn't me tonight, it'll be someone else next week. And maybe they won't just lose a piece of furniture, they'll lose something that can't be replaced, something that tells a part of their history no one else will bother to preserve. They started walking again, the sounds of the city. Just ahead a car passing, the faint music spilling from an open restaurant door. Julian was quiet for a moment before speaking. You should know, going after them like that, it won't be easy. This is a well-connected circle. I'll make you the problem before they ever admit they have one. Ava almost smiled, but it wasn't from humor. That's fine. I've been the problem before. He glanced at her as if weighing whether her resolve was confidence or recklessness. If you're serious, then we start with finding out where the desk is going. The developer's representative who bought it tonight? I can get a name, maybe even the shipment details. Once you know where it's headed, you'll have a much clearer path. She thought about that, picturing the desk crated and loaded onto a truck, disappearing into some faceless holding space. She imagined it sitting in a sterile lobby, admired by strangers who didn't know what the carvings meant, who didn't see the initials etched inside the hidden compartment. The thought hardened her resolve. I don't just want to get it back for me, she said. I want people to know it was stolen in the first place, that my great-grandfather made it, that it doesn't belong to them, no matter how many receipts they have. Julian nodded slowly, like a man making a decision. All right, I'll make some calls tomorrow. I'll put you in touch with someone who's been digging into the auction world's less savory habits. If you're going to expose them, you'll need more than just one incident. You'll need a pattern you can prove. Ava's stride lengthened again. Then let's prove it. They reached the corner, where the light from a cafe spilled across the pavement. Julian paused there, pulling a business card from his coat and handing it to her. Call me in the morning, he said. We'll start from there. She took the card without looking at it, slipping it into her pocket. I will. Walked away. Ava stood for a moment under the streetlight, feeling the weight of the night settle into something sharper. This wasn't going to be a clean fight, and it wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time since she stepped into that auction room, she felt the heat in her chest start to transform not into resignation, but into a plan. The week that followed was a blur of coffee-fueled late nights, stacks of notes, and a growing folder of documents that Ava guarded like it was evidence in a criminal trial. She started with the auction house's public records, combing through press releases, sales reports, and the glossy promotional pieces they fed to magazines. That catered to collectors. On the surface, everything gleamed: cord sales, prestigious consignments, celebrity clients. But she knew better than to trust the polish. The first real crack appeared on the third day, buried in the archives of a niche art market blog. Was a 4-year-old article that mentioned, almost in passing, an incident where a bidder had accused the auctioneer of ignoring her raised paddle during the sale of a rare quilt. The bidder, a black woman from Detroit, claimed she'd been skipped twice in favor of a dealer known for supplying luxury hotel chains. The story hadn't gone anywhere, no follow-up, no public complaint, but Ava saved the page, marking it as the first of what she suspected would be many. She expanded her search beyond art and antique circles, pulling local newspaper archives, court records, and even the minutes from city council meetings where the auction house had appeared in. Discussions about zoning for new development projects. That's where she started to see the threads connecting. The last 8 years. The auction house had sold several historically significant items tied to minority communities' quilts. Furniture, ceremonial artifacts, even a rare set of photographs. From a black-owned newspaper in the 1920s, in almost every case, the winning bid went to a buyer with ties to the same small circle of high-end developers. Ava dug deeper, cross-referencing buyer names with corporate filings. That was when the auctioneer's name began to appear never directly linked to the purchases, but consistently present in business dinners, charity galas, and real estate investment boards, alongside these same developers. The transactions always looked clean on paper, but there was a pattern. Pieces that should have ended up in museums or in the hands of families, with legitimate claims, were instead funneled to entities that saw them as investments or decorative trophies. One late night, bleary-eyed from hours at her laptop, Ava found herself scrolling through photos from past auctions, looking for the subtle cues that told more than the sales lists did. She noticed how the auctioneer's gaze always seemed to settle on the same faces, the same clusters of bidders. She watched videos of the events, slowing the footage to catch moments where a hand was raised but not acknowledged, where a bid was made but never repeated because the person was simply overlooked. By the end of the week, Ava's wall was lined with sticky notes and printouts, a rough timeline taking shape. It wasn't enough to accuse anyone outright, not yet, but the outline was there. Pattern of selective acknowledgement and bidding. A chain of sales leading to a concentrated group of buyers. And in the middle of it all, the auctioneer, acting as the polished, respectable face of what was starting to look a lot like a gatekeeping operation for cultural and historical property. She closed her laptop and leaned back, rubbing her eyes. The work had been exhausting, but it had sharpened her focus. The desk her great-grandfather built wasn't just an isolated injustice, it was one piece in a much larger puzzle. She had enough pieces to see the edges forming. Julian called late that night, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "I've been hearing from a few contacts," he said. "Seems you've been busy. I found more than I expected," Ava replied. "And I think this goes deeper than either of us thought." There was a pause on the line, then a quiet, approving hum. "Good. Because if you want to expose them, this is how you start, by showing it's not just one mistake. It's a system." Ava glanced at the photo of the desk taped above her desk, the carved legs and polished surface frozen under the auction's bright lights. "Then it's time to break it," she said. Her week of research had given her more than information, it had given her a path forward, and she intended to take it. Julian arranged the meeting in the kind of place where no one would think to look for them, a small cafe on the edge of the arts district. The sort of spot where the paint on the walls peeled in curling strips and mismatched. Chairs surrounded tables scuffed from years of use. It smelled of espresso and something sweet baking in the back. The air was warm, humming with the quiet rhythm of people working or speaking in low tones. Ava arrived first, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the door. She had been running on caffeine and momentum all week, mind still churning with the threads she had uncovered about the auction house. The pattern was there. Now she needed someone who could help her turn it into a story that couldn't be buried. Julian walked in a few minutes later, holding the door for a woman with sharp, dark eyes and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. She was petite, her hair pulled into a messy knot, and she moved with the alertness of someone who noticed everything in the room without appearing to look. "Ava, this is Elena Cruz," Julian said, stepping aside as the woman extended her hand. "Nice to meet you," Elena said. Her voice carried a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to be raised to hold weight. Ava shook her hand and gestured for them to sit. "Julian tells me you know your way around stories people don't want told." A faint smile flickered on Elena's face. It's one way to put it. "I investigate the art and antiques market, private sales, museum acquisitions, auction houses. Anywhere money and history get tangled together, someone's trying to hide something. That's exactly what's happening here," Ava said. "I've spent the past week pulling every thread I can find on this auction house. Been ignoring bids from certain people, funneling items to the same group of buyers, and those buyers are tied to developers. My family's desk was just one of the things they've taken." Lena leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Julian mentioned the desk. He also mentioned the auctioneer skipped you twice. 3 times, Ava corrected. And it wasn't an accident. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, the kind of look that said she was already filing the information into place. If you want to go after them, you need more than suspicion. You need documented proof of a pattern and, not just from your experience. Other witnesses, other victims, transactions that look too neat to be clean. Ava nodded. I've already found a few cases people overlooked. Items disappearing into private collections. But I know I can't get this into the light without someone who knows how to make it stick. That's where I come in, Elena said. But I'll warn you now, these people play dirty. If they realize you're digging into them, they won't just try to discredit you. They'll go after it. Your credibility, your livelihood, even your personal life. They've done it before. I've been sued twice, threatened more times than I can count. Ava didn't flinch. I'm not afraid of them. Lena studied her for a moment, as though testing whether that resolve was real. Good, but courage isn't enough. You'll need to be strategic. We collect quietly, we corroborate, and we don't move until we're sure we can withstand the blowback. Once this is public, there's no taking it back. Julian had been silent, letting the two women feel each other out. Well, he spoke. Elena's very good at what she does. If she's in, you'll have someone who knows how to put the right kind of pressure in the right places. Ava met Elena's gaze and extended her hand again. Then let's do it. Elena shook it, her grip firm. All right. Send me everything you've got so far. Every document, every name, every sale. You think is connected? And be ready to start talking to people who've been burned by them before. That's where we'll find the real story. The meeting ended with the quiet certainty of a pact made. As Ava stepped back out into the cool air, she felt the weight of what she was taking on settle more firmly across her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. With Elena on board, it had the potential to become something much big. Enough to make the people who thought they could erase her wish they'd never tried. The next 2 weeks blurred into a routine of dimly lit coffee shops, late-night calls, and the glow of laptop screens casting tired shadows across their faces. Ava and Elena worked in sync, each bringing a different kind of precision to the hunt. Ava knew the desk's history intimately, the photographs, the family stories, the way her grandmother's voice softened when she spoke about her father building it. Elena knew how to dig through the layers of bureaucracy and misdirection that institutions use to hide their tracks. They started with the sale records from the auction house. Elena had contacts who could get them more than the glossy public. Listings, slipping them internal lot histories that most clients never saw. Ava scanned each entry until her eyes ached, looking for the desk's name in the tangled chain of provenance. When they finally found it, the trail was suspiciously thin. The auction's official record listed the desk as part of a private estate collection, acquired in a bulk lot 2 years earlier. There were no photographs of it before that, no references to its presence in any notable collections, no public sales history at all. For an antique of its quality, that absence was its own kind of evidence. Lena frowned at the document. A piece like this doesn't just vanish for decades and then reappear in a bulk lot. They're hiding something. From there, they followed the paper trail sideways, not forward. Elena suggested they look into property records in the neighborhoods where similar estate finds had originated. That was when they found a foreclosure and eviction notice from 3 years ago in a part of the city Ava knew too well. The street name alone made her stomach tighten. It was the same neighborhood her grandmother had lived in until the late 90s, before the first wave of redevelopment pushed most of the original families out. The property belonged to an elderly woman named Lorraine Hayes, according to court filings. She'd been evicted after a dispute with a management company over unpaid rent, though the filings made no mention of the fact that she'd been in the building for 40 years and had receipts showing overpayment. What made Ava's pulse quicken was the next piece of the puzzle. A list from a storage facility showing that Loren's belongings had been seized after she allegedly fell behind on storage fees. The contents of her unit were auctioned off to a private buyer for a sum so small, it might as well have been theft. The description of the items matched more than a dozen lots that had later appeared in the auction house's catalogs. And there, Listed under miscellaneous furniture was an oak desk with carved legs. Ava sat back, staring at the screen. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is how they got it." Lena leaned over her shoulder, scanning the entry. "The management company does this a lot. Pushes people out, seizes what's left, and sells it to intermediaries, who pass it along to places like our friends at the auction house. By the time it hits the sales floor, the history's been scrubbed clean. The weight of it settled over Ava, not just the theft of the desk, but the way it had been erased from her family's story in a process so ordinary, it barely registered as a crime to the people doing it." Elena began pulling linked cases, highlighting instances where the same buyer had snapped up storage unit contents from other wrongfully evicted tenants. The names tied back again and again to shell companies with mailing addresses in the same building as the auction house's business office. It was a closed loop. Push people out, strip their history, sell it to the highest bidder. Ava closed her laptop and rubbed her temples. They didn't just take it. They built an entire system to make sure they could. Lena's tone was steady, but her eyes were sharp. "And now we have the proof. This isn't just about you getting your desk back anymore. This is a story about how they've been doing this for years. Now, if we tell it right, they won't be able to make it disappear." Ava nodded slowly. The truth was there, and the documents spread across the table. All that was left was to decide how far she was willing to go to make it heard. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Just as Ava was sorting through another stack of documents Elena had forwarded that morning. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code was local. She let it ring twice before answering, her tone cautious. "Miss Thompson?" The voice on the other end was smooth, deliberate.
"Hi."
The kind of tone people practiced when they wanted to sound both polite and in control. "Yes," she said, sitting back in her chair. "This is Matthew Lang from Davenport and Rowe," the man continued. "I represent the firm that acquired the property in question at last week's auction." Her pulse ticked up, but she kept her voice even. "You mean the desk?" There was a faint pause, just long enough for her to imagine him adjusting his tie. "Correct. I understand you have concerns regarding its provenance. Yes. I also understand you've been making inquiries, keen questions about our clients." "Purchase." "I have," Ava said simply. She didn't offer more. Lang cleared his throat softly. "Our client values the integrity of their acquisitions, and they prefer to resolve misunderstandings discreetly, in the interest of avoiding unnecessary complications. They are prepared to offer you compensation for your time and any perceived grievance." Ava leaned forward, her elbows on the table. "Compensation." "Yes," Lang said, his voice taking on a slightly brighter edge, like a salesman sensing a potential close. "A fair sum, to acknowledge your interest in the item, with the understanding that the matter will be considered settled. You would agree to cease any further inquiries into the item's history and to refrain from making any public statements regarding the sale." Her eyes moved to the photo of the desk, pinned to her wall. "How much?" she asked, her voice deliberately flat. He named a figure large enough to make most people pause, small enough to make clear they thought she could be bought without much effort. Ava almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. She imagined him on the other end, sitting in some corner office with a view of the city, assuming that a check could smooth away what had happened in that auction hall. "You think this is about money?" she said finally. "We understand it's about resolving a dispute," Lang replied, still in that measured tone. "No," Ava said, her voice sharpening. "It's about the fact that your client bought stolen property. It's about the fact that it was taken from someone after a wrongful eviction, laundered through shell companies, and sold in a room where I wasn't even allowed to bid. Now you're calling me to make sure none of that comes to light." Lang's silence lasted just a fraction too long. When he spoke again, his voice had cooled. "Miss Thompson, I think you misunderstand my role. I'm here to present an amicable resolution. If you decline, the situation may become more complicated for you." There it was, the shift from polite to pointed she'd been expecting. I'm sure it will," she said. "But let me save you some time. I'm not interested in your check. I'm not dropping this matter until that desk is back where it belongs." "Your position is noted," Lang said, the warmth now gone entirely. "I'll inform my client." "Do that," she replied. and ended the call before he could say anything else. The room was quiet again, but the tension lingered in her shoulders. She sat for a moment, letting her breathing steady. This was no longer about reclaiming a single piece of furniture it hadn't been for a while. The money they had offered wasn't just an attempt to end her fight. It was proof of how badly they wanted her silent. She picked up her phone and called Alina. When the journalist answered, Ava didn't bother with small talk. "They tried to buy me off," she said. "Good," Alina replied. "It means you're hitting a nerve." Ava hung up a moment later, more certain than ever. The desk had started this, but dignity and the refusal to be erased was going to finish it. It started small, so small, Ava almost missed it. The first review appeared on a Monday morning, buried among the usual weekend feedback her business received. She ran a modest but well-respected interior design studio, one built on years of word-of-mouth referrals and carefully maintained relationships. The comment was brief, unsigned except for a first name that didn't match any client she'd worked with. Unprofessional and untrustworthy. Wouldn't recommend. Ava frowned at it, but didn't think much of it. One bad review among dozens of glowing ones was nothing. By Wednesday, there were 5 more. They came in rapid succession, each with a different story: missed deadlines, poor quality work, rude communication. None of them described real projects she'd taken on, and none could be traced to legitimate clients. The language was just believable enough to make anyone reading them hesitate. She flagged them as suspicious, contacted the review platform, and received a polite but unhelpful response about following their process. On Friday, her phone buzzed with an email from one of her regular suppliers. The subject line, order. Status seemed routine, the body wasn't. They were reevaluating their business partnerships and could no longer fulfill her requests. No explanation beyond that. When she called to ask for clarification, the sales manager's tone was nervous. "It's nothing personal, Ava. We can't get caught in anything that might reflect badly on us." She hung up slowly, the pieces clicking together in her mind. This wasn't random. This was someone reaching into her life, trying to squeeze until she backed off. The following week, the whispers began. A friend from one of her networking groups pulled her aside after a meeting, her voice low. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you and the auction thing, but people are saying you're stirring up trouble with some powerful names. Be careful. This isn't a fight you can win." Another call came from an old client who'd heard rumors that Ava was difficult to work with. She laughed it off over the phone, but when she hung up, the laughter died quickly. She knew exactly where the rumors were coming from. Every move they made was calculated to wear her down, not enough to be obvious harassment, but enough to make her doubt whether the fight was worth the cost. It was the kind of pressure that didn't come with threats shouted in the open, but with small, precise cuts meant to bleed her quietly. Ava's friends noticed the change in her schedule. She was more guarded now, spending late nights poring over documents with Alina, scanning her email for signs of the next blow. Julian called to check in, and after hearing what was happening, let out a humorless laugh. "They're pushing back. It means you're getting close." "They're trying to bury me," Ava said. "They're trying to scare you into walking away," Julian corrected. "If you do, they win."
At night.
Ava sat in her office after the lights had gone out, the only glow coming from her desk lamp. She thought about her grandmothers. Stories about the generations before her who had faced much worse and refused to be erased. The desk was more than a piece of furniture now. It was a symbol of the fight she was in. Symbols, she knew, only had power if you were willing to defend them. When Alina called later to discuss their next steps, Ava's voice was steady. "They want me to back down," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "Good," Alina replied, "because now we make the next move." Ava closed her laptop, the sound sharp in the quiet room. The message had been sent, loud and clear. They could smear her name, cut off her supplies, try to starve her out of her own business. It wouldn't matter. She'd already decided she wasn't letting go. Alina didn't tell Ava exactly when she was going to start. She only said, "You'll know," and then went quiet for 2 days. On the third morning, Ava's phone buzzed with a link from a journalist she didn't know. It was a short piece on a niche art blog. Just a few paragraphs, but the headline was enough to stop her mid-sip of coffee. whispers of bias at elite. Auction house raised questions about recent sales. The article didn't name Ava or the desk outright, but the details were unmistakable to anyone familiar with the auction. It described a high-value antique purchased by a developer, alleged that a qualified bidder had been overlooked multiple times, and hinted at long-standing patterns of selective recognition toward certain clients. There was even a quote from an unnamed source. Ava guessed about how these incidents were part of a systemic issue in the industry. By noon, the piece had been picked up by 2 larger art publications, each adding their own speculation. One ran archival footage of past auctions, slowing it down to show bidders being ignored. Another dug into the auctioneer's history, noting his close ties to a cluster of developers and high-end property firms. Ava watched it spread in real time. Emails trickled in from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Other designers, Few collectors she'd met at past events, even a former professor from her college days. The messages were short but telling. Saw the article. Doesn't surprise me. If you need a statement, I was there. Finally, someone saying it out loud. The ripple effect was quick inside the art community. On social media, smaller accounts started posting about their own experiences being overlooked at auctions. A Native American artist recounted watching a tribal artifact go to a private buyer despite his attempt to bid. A black couple from Atlanta shared that they'd stopped attending certain houses, altogether because they couldn't justify paying for humiliation. None of it was an outright storm yet, but Ava could feel the shift. The conversation had begun, and the auction house could no longer control the narrative as neatly as they had before. The first signs of discomfort came in the form of a carefully worded statement they released 2 days later. It denied any intentional bias, but promised to review procedures to ensure fairness for all participants. It read like a template they dusted off for just such a moment. Julian called her that evening, a faint satisfaction in his voice. They're rattled. You can tell by the speed of the response. They're trying to stop it before it grows. It's going to grow, Ava said. Lena was already pushing it further. She had ceded the story to a pair of investigative reporters she trusted, feeding them just enough verified information to entice them into digging deeper. She was deliberate in her pacing, careful to build momentum without overwhelming the story with too many details too soon. The goal, she explained when they met for coffee, is to make them answer questions they can't control the timing of. We give the right people just enough to keep asking for more. It worked. Within a week, a well-known culture magazine had announced they were preparing a feature on accountability and ethics in high-end auctions. The topic was vague enough to keep the lawyers from getting involved too early, but everyone in the circle knew where the spotlight would eventually land. At the next networking event Ava attended, the atmosphere was different. Conversations shifted when she walked into the room, but not in the cold, dismissive way she'd felt before. This was curiosity, even a little respect. A few people approached her cautiously, testing the waters with phrases like, "I read something recently," or "that thing in the news was that." She never confirmed, but she didn't deny it either. It wasn't victory, not yet. But for the first time, the auction house wasn't the only one defining what had happened. And that meant Ava was no longer the only voice in the fight. The invitation arrived in the form of a brief email from Julia. No explanation. It's just a time and address, and the words, "Don't be late." Ava arrived 15 minutes early, parking a block away from the address in the upscale arts district. The building was a sleek, glass-fronted gallery that specialized in showcasing the private holdings of developers and collectors, a space designed as much for quiet bragging as for genuine appreciation of art. Julian was waiting for her outside, his coat buttoned against the wind. "They're expecting us," he said, and his tone carried the weight of careful negotiation. Whatever strings he'd pulled to make this happen hadn't been easy to tug. Inside, the gallery smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. Walls were a stark white, the lighting warm but deliberately positioned to make each piece look like it had its own halo. Ava's heels made a soft sound against the polished concrete floor as they followed a young assistant through a series of open rooms. She noticed the way the assistant kept glancing back at her, curious, maybe even suspicious, but said nothing. They stopped in front of a small display area toward the back, cordoned off by a low velvet rope. And there it was. The desk. Great-grandfather's desk. Even under the gallery's perfect lighting, she could see the faint wear along the edges, the patina that no restoration could erase. The carved legs were as she remembered from photographs, intricate and precise, and the floral motif along the front edge seemed to catch the light in a way that made the wood glow. For a long moment, Ava just stood there, her throat tightening. She'd imagined this moment so many times, and now that it was here, it felt almost unreal. Julian spoke quietly beside her. "You'll have time with it. Told them you were an antiques consultant, doing a verification for a private catalog." The assistant unhooked the rope and stepped back, giving her space. Ava approached slowly, running her fingers along the smooth surface. She traced the carvings, feeling the faint ridges where her great-grandfather's tools had left their mark. Her attention moved to the right-hand drawer. Da-da-da-da, she pulled it open and inspected the dovetail joints, perfectly aligned just as she'd expected, but it was what lay behind the drawer that mattered. She glanced at Julian, and he gave a subtle nod. Ava slid her hand inside, feeling along the back panel until her fingers found the small, hidden catch. With a gentle push, the false back released with a soft click, revealing a narrow compartment just large enough to hold a stack of letters or a small ledger. The space was empty now, but the proof she needed wasn't about the contents. It was about the mark. She bent closer, angling the compartment toward the light. And there it was. 3 initials carved in small, neat letters, etc. Elijah Thomas Carter. Her great-grandfather's signature? Her chest tightened, a rush of pride and anger mingling in her veins. Pride, because his work had survived decades of theft and neglect. Anger, because it had been taken, stripped from its rightful place, and displayed here as just another trophy in someone else's collection. She took out her phone and snapped a series of photos-wide shots of the desk. Close-ups of the carvings and, most importantly, detailed images of the initials inside the hidden compartment. She also recorded a short video narrating softly. For Elena's benefit, hidden compartment, right-hand drawer, initials, etc., consistent with family documentation. Julian stood watch, keeping an eye on the assistant, who seemed content to linger at the far end of the room, tapping at a tablet. When Ava closed the compartment and slid the drawer back into place, she let her hand rest on the desk a moment longer. She wanted to leave something of herself here, even if it was only the quiet promise that this was not where the desk's story would end. As they left the gallery, the assistant replaced the rope and gave them both a polite, distant smile. Outside, the air felt colder than before. Julian glanced at her as they walked toward the street. "You got what you needed?" She met his gaze. "More than that. I got proof. And now they can't pretend it's just a piece of furniture anymore." Julian nodded, but there was a glint in his eye, something like caution. "Then be ready. Proof changes the game, but it also raises the stakes." Ava knew he was right. And as she slid into her car, she felt the weight of the photographs in her phone, not just as evidence, but as a promise that she wasn't going to stop until the desk was home. Ava spread the photographs across her kitchen table, the images, arranged in neat rows like pieces of a puzzle she had been building for weeks. In each frame, the desk's craftsmanship was undeniable, every carved detail, every gentle curve of the legs, every precise line of the floral motif, but it was the close-ups of the hidden compartment that made her pause every time. The initials were clear, the carving slightly weathered but still sharp enough to read, etc. Elijah Thomas Carter. Her great-grandfather's mark left in a place only someone who knew the desk intimately would think to look. Beside the photographs lay a small stack of papers, each one a piece of the story that tied the desk to her family. There was the grainy black-and-white photo of her great-grandfather standing beside the desk in his workshop, sleeves rolled up, pride in his posture. There were handwritten letters from her grandmother referencing your grandfather's desk. In connection to the shop's accounts, there was the city business license from 1931 with Elijah Thomas Carter's name in bold ink, listing fine wood furnishings as his trade. Lena sat across from her, flipping slowly through the documents, making small notes in the margins of her reporter's pad. "This isn't just good," she said finally, glancing up. "Hey, this is airtight. It's provenance, craftsmanship, personal history. If this was a court case, we'd already be winning." Ava leaned back in her chair. Then it's time, Alina said, holding up a finger. We have to be smart about how we do this. Once we go public, they'll throw everything at us, legal threats, discrediting campaigns, maybe even try to lose the desk in the shuffle. We need to make sure the story comes out in a way they can't shut down. Ava knew she was right. The desk had been her focus for so long that the thought of losing it again this time to a sudden disappearance into some private vault made her chest tighten. So what's the plan? Alina spread out her own papers, a draft press release, a list of journalists she trusted, and a timeline of the auction house's recent controversies. First, we get the photos and documents into the hands of people who will run the story exactly as it needs to be told. We frame it as part of a larger pattern because it is end. We make you the voice of that pattern. Second, we time the release with a public confrontation. Ava arched an eyebrow. Public confrontation? Yes, Alina said. The Auctioneer is scheduled to host a charity event next month at the City Museum. Its high-profile press will be there. And it's not his turf, it's a public venue. He won't have the same control over who gets to speak and who doesn't. We make sure you're there. And when the questions start flying, you bring the receipts, the initials, the photographs. Everything. The idea of facing him in that kind of setting made Ava's pulse quicken. She remembered the way he'd dismissed her in that auction hall, the almost patronizing smirk when he'd told her she wouldn't have been able to keep up. She'd wanted to answer him then, but this would be better. What if he tries to walk away? Ava asked. Then we make it impossible, Alina replied, her tone firm. We'll have reporters ready with questions and the story already circulating. By the time he steps up to that podium, he'll know the world is watching. Ava studied the photographs again, her gaze lingering on the initials. She thought of her great-grandfather's hands, steady and skilled, cutting those letters into the wood. He couldn't have known they'd become a lifeline decades later, proof against people who thought they could take what they wanted and rewrite the history behind it. She gathered the photos and documents into a single folder, securing them with a thick elastic band. All right, she said, her voice steady. Let's go public. Lena smiled faintly, though there was steel in her eyes. Good, but remember, once this starts, there's no undoing it. You have to be ready for every hit they'll send your way. I've been ready since the day he ignored my bid, Ava said. They sat in silence. For a moment, the weight of the decision settling between them. Outside, the evening light was fading, shadows stretching across the street. In the dim glow of the kitchen, the photographs on the table seemed to take on a quiet life of their own, like the desk was already making its way back home. Ava wasn't just holding evidence, she was holding a promise. And soon, she was going to make sure everyone who mattered saw it. The press conference was held in the side hall of a community art center, a space Alina had chosen carefully. It wasn't flashy, but it had good acoustics, clean sightlines for cameras, and, most importantly, it wasn't a place the auction house could control. Folding chairs were set in tight rows facing a simple podium, the walls behind it lined with local artwork on loan from neighborhood artists. Ava arrived early, folder in hand, her photographs and documents tucked neatly inside. The air was already buzzing with the low hum of voices, reporters checking their notes, photographers adjusting their equipment, camera crews setting up along the back wall. She spotted Julian near the door, speaking in quiet tones to a journalist. She recognized from one of the art magazines that had been following the story. When he saw her, he gave a small nod of encouragement. Lena was at the podium, going over the order of speakers. She had insisted on keeping it simple, Ava first, followed by a brief statement from a legal advisor who could address the property claim. And then a Q&A. Don't overthink it, Elena told her quietly. Tell them what happened, show them the proof, and let the facts do the rest. When it was time, Ava stepped up to the microphone, her fingers resting lightly on the edges of the podium. For a moment, the chatter in the room continued, but as she began to speak, the noise died down. My name is Ava Thompson, she said, her voice steady but carrying enough weight to cut through the room. A little over a month ago, I attended an auction at one of the city's most prominent houses. I went there to bid on a desk my great-grandfather built a piece of my family's history. I was prepared to compete for it. I raised my paddle multiple times, but the auctioneer never acknowledged me. Not once. She paused, letting the words settle. A few reporters began scribbling. I wasn't overlooked by mistake. I was ignored, skipped over in favor of bidders, the auctioneer. Clearly preferred. This wasn't just about me. This auction house has a pattern of deciding who gets to participate and who doesn't. And that decision has everything to do with who you are, not whether you can afford to be in the room. She reached into her folder and pulled out one of the photographs, holding it up so the nearest cameras could zoom in. This is the desk, she continued. And inside this desk is a hidden compartment when my great-grandfather built himself. In that compartment are his initials, carved in his own hand, etc. Elijah Thomas Carter. I have documentation photographs, letters, business records that prove this piece was his work and part of his shop until it was taken decades ago. She laid the photograph on the podium, then pulled out the next. A close-up of the carved initials, sharp and clear under the light. The room shifted as people leaned forward, phones and cameras catching every detail. This desk was acquired illegally, she said. It was taken from a storage unit after a wrongful eviction in my family's old neighborhood, funneled through intermediaries and sold to the auction house without any regard for its true ownership. And this is not an isolated case. I've spoken with others who have been ignored in that room, who have watched their bids passed over or their family's property disappear into private collections. From the back, someone called out, "Are you accusing the auctioneer of discrimination?" Ava met the reporter's gaze, stating it. What happened to me was deliberate. What's been happening for years is deliberate. This isn't. Just business said systemic exclusion. You could see some of the reporters exchange glances, the energy in the room sharpening. On one side, a man in a tailored suit, representing the auction house, no doubt shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Today, I'm calling for the immediate return of my family's desk, Ava continued. And I'm asking for a full investigation into this auction house's practices, how they decide which bids to accept, how they verify the ownership of the items they sell, and why so many of their sales benefit the same circle of high-end developers. When she stepped back from the microphone, Lena's legal contact came forward to outline the property claim in precise, careful language. Cameras clicked in a steady rhythm, but Ava's eyes caught on a face near the back of the room. The auctioneer himself had walked in quietly during her statement. His usual air of confidence still in place, but there was a stiffness to his posture that hadn't been there the night of the auction. For a fleeting second their eyes met. Smile, always a touch smug, was tight now, almost brittle. She could see him calculating, measuring the damage, wondering how much control he had lost in this moment. When the Q&A began, the first question was directed not to her, but to him. A reporter turned in his seat and asked, "Do you have a response to these allegations?" He hesitated before answering, and in that hesitation, Ava saw what she'd been waiting for, the first visible crack in the image he had worked so hard to maintain. The day after the press conference, Ava met her attorney in a narrow office overlooking the courthouse. The space was functional rather than stylish stacks of case files on every flat surface, a single potted plant struggling for sunlight near the window. Her attorney, Denise Caldwell, had a reputation for taking on cases most firms wouldn't touch. She was sharp, direct, and uninterested in small talk. They went over everything again, the photographs, the family documents, the testimony from witnesses at the auction, and the timeline Alina had meticulously compiled, showing the desk's path from wrongful eviction to the auction floor. Denise asked pointed questions, probing for weaknesses, and Ava answered each one with the calm determination that had carried her through the past month. When they finished, Denise leaned back, tapping the edge of her pen against the desk. "We filed 2 actions," she said. 1, a discrimination lawsuit against the auction house for refusing to acknowledge your bids based on bias. 2, a property claim against both the auction house and the developer for unlawful possession of the desk. We hit them on both fronts. Ava nodded. And we do it now. Denise's paralegal began typing before the meeting was over. By the end of the day, both suits were drafted, signed, and submitted to the court. The filings were public record, and Denise made sure they landed in the hands of the right journalists before the ink was dry. The reaction was swift. By the following morning, major news outlets had picked up the story, expanding it beyond the art and antiques world. Headlines framed it as a fight about more than one piece of furniture. It was about access, equity, and accountability in an industry long shielded from scrutiny. The developer who had purchased the desk found themselves caught in the storm. At first, they stayed silent. But as the coverage intensified, their name began appearing alongside phrases like complicit in questionable acquisitions and linked to discriminatory practices. Stockholders started asking questions. A high-profile client announced they were pausing a multi-million-dollar project with the firm, pending further clarity on the situation. By the end of the week, the developer issued a statement. It was carefully worded, the kind of language crafted by expensive lawyers and public relations experts. But the meaning was clear. They were distancing themselves from the auction house. They claimed they had been unaware of any irregularities in the sale, expressed their commitment to ethical procurement, and most tellingly said they were reviewing the circumstances surrounding the acquisition of the desk. In question, Julian called Ava the moment the statement went live. "That's not just a review," he said. "That's them looking for a way to hand it back without admitting they did anything wrong." Alina was less charitable. "They're saving themselves. They'll cut the auction house loose if it means protecting their own name." Ava didn't care about their motives. If the pressure campaign pushed the developer to step away, it would leave the auction house exposed and without one of its most influential allies. Inside the auction house, the cracks widened. Anonymous sources told reporters that staff morale was collapsing, that upcoming consignments were being withdrawn, and that the auctioneer himself had been quietly removed from hosting duties for the next two events. Denise kept Ava grounded in the legal process, reminding her that lawsuits took time and that public opinion, while powerful, couldn't replace a court ruling. But Ava could feel the momentum shifting. For the first time, the balance of power no longer sat entirely in the auctioneer's hands. Late one evening, Ava sat at her kitchen table with the lawsuit copies spread in front of her. She traced her finger over her name on the first page of each filing. It wasn't just about reclaiming the desk anymore. It was about forcing a reckoning-making. The answer for every ignored bid, every stolen piece, every silent erasure they thought no one would challenge. And now, with the developer pulling away and the lawsuits moving forward, she could see the outcome she'd been fighting for starting to take shape. The desk was within reach. But more than that, so was justice. The offer came in the form of a thick envelope hand-delivered to Denise's office. Ava was there when it arrived, sitting across from her attorney as they reviewed the latest filings. The courier left without a word, and Denise slit the envelope open with the practiced flick of a letter opener. She read the first page silently. Her expression narrowing in a way Ava had learned meant the contents were important, but not in a good way. "They're offering you the desk," Denise said finally, sliding the papers across the desk. Ava scanned the first paragraph. It was written in the precise, bloodless language of lawyers who wanted to sound generous while saying as little as possible. The auction house would return the desk to her possession, at no cost. Within 10 business days on, the condition that she dropped both the discrimination suit and the property claim, and signed a non-disclosure agreement preventing her from speaking publicly about the matter again. She set the papers down. "They think this will end it." Denise leaned back in her chair. "To them, it's a clean solution. They lose one item, they keep their business intact, and they gag you from talking about the rest." Ava stared at the envelope, her jaw tightening. They still get to do this to other people. They keep the system in place. I've become the example they use to say, "See, we make things right." "That's exactly what they want," Denise said. A quiet conclusion, no admission of wrongdoing, no precedent set in court, no change to how they operate. Just a transaction that gets them out of the headlines. Julian, who had joined them that afternoon, spoke from his seat in the corner. "They're trying to buy silence with sentiment. They know the desk means more to you than anything else, and they're betting you'll take it to avoid the fight." Ava looked down at the photographs of the desk that still sat in her folder, the initials carved into the hidden compartment. She thought about the long weeks of digging through records, of finding Lorraine Hayes' eviction notice, of reading the names of others who had been erased in the same quiet way. She thought about the people who had reached out after the story went public, people she had never met, but who trusted her to keep pushing because they couldn't. "It's not enough," she said. Denise nodded once, unsurprised. "Then we reject it, but be prepared. They'll escalate. If they can't make you fold with the desk, they'll try something else. Discrediting you, dragging this out in court to drain your resources. You have to be ready for the long haul." "I've been ready since the day he looked me in the eye and decided I didn't matter," Ava said. Julian leaned forward. "You walk away with just the desk. They survive untouched. If you see this through, you might actually force the changes that stop them from doing it again. That's bigger than any single piece of furniture." Ava met his gaze. "That's exactly why we keep going." Denise drafted the response that afternoon, a concise rejection that left no room for interpretation. The lawsuits would proceed. In full, no settlement, no confidentiality agreement. The desk was not a bargaining chip, it was evidence. By the time Ava left the office, the sky had turned the color of deep steel, the city lights flickering on one by one. She walked slowly to her car, the weight of her decision settling over her shoulders. She could have ended it today. She could have had the desk in her home within a week, could have avoided months of court hearings and public scrutiny. But the thought of accepting their terms felt like betrayal, not just to her great-grandfather's memory, but to everyone who had been pushed aside, ignored, or stripped of what was theirs because the system made it easy for the powerful to take. When she started the engine, she felt the same clarity she'd had at the press conference. This was never going to be just about an heirloom. It was about dismantling the idea that they could decide who mattered and who didn't. And no settlement, no matter how polished or generous it looked on paper, was worth giving that fight away. The verdict came on a gray Tuesday morning, nearly a year after the auction. The courtroom was smaller than Ava had expected for something that had consumed so much of her life. Pale wood paneling lined the walls, the air faintly smelling of paper and coffee. Rows of benches sat mostly empty, except for a few journalists, Julian, Alina, and a scattering of community members who had followed the case since the first press conference. Ava sat beside Denise at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had told herself she wouldn't focus on the auctioneer, seated several feet away with his lawyers, but she caught his profile in her peripheral vision. The same posture he'd had at the auction, upright, controlled, was there, but the swagger was gone. Months of hearings, depositions, and unflattering headlines had stripped away the unshakable confidence he once wore like armor. When the judge entered, the room shifted into silence. The clerk read through procedural notes, the legal cadence slow and deliberate, before reaching the decision. On the claim of unlawful discrimination, the clerk began, "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ava Thompson." Ava's grip on her hands tightened. "On the claim of unlawful possession and wrongful sale of property, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Ava Thompson." The words were simple, but they landed like a final blow. She glanced at Denise, who allowed herself the faintest nod of satisfaction before looking back toward the bench. The judge's reasoning was read into the record, outlining the key points. Multiple witnesses confirming Ava's bids were deliberately ignored. documented evidence showing a pattern of similar treatment toward other minority bidders. An irrefutable proof of the desk's provenance and its unlawful removal from her family's possession. The judge didn't mince words about the auctioneer's conduct, calling it a clear abuse of position, undermining the fairness of public commerce, and perpetuating exclusionary practices. The ruling went further than Ava had dared to hope. The auctioneer's individual license to conduct sales was revoked effective immediately, and the auction house was fined heavily, not just for the wrongful sale, but for what the judge called systemic violations of ethical and legal obligations. The fine was large enough to make headlines on its own, a figure that would force the business to reconsider every aspect of how it operated, if it could operate at all. The desk, of course, was to be returned to Ava without delay, along with a formal acknowledgement of her family's ownership and a public correction to the auction house's sales records. There was no applause, it wasn't that kind of setting, but in the quiet of the courtroom, Ava felt something uncoil in her chest. Months of strain, of waking up each day to emails, legal drafts, and news articles, all built toward this moment. She hadn't just won the desk back. She had won the fight they'd told her she couldn't win. As the session adjourned, the auctioneer stood briefly, his face tight, as he avoided looking in her direction. His lawyers gathered their papers in silence. Julian was the first to reach her. "You didn't just win," he said, clasping her shoulder. "You made sure they can't do it again. That's the difference." Elena followed, her recorder in hand, though for once she didn't ask a single question. She just smiled. Kind of smile that came from seeing something through to the end. Outside the courthouse, the press was waiting. Cameras flashed as Ava stepped up to the microphones, the desk's photograph tucked inside her bag. She didn't prepare a long speech. "This was never just about one piece of furniture," she said, her voice steady. "It was about fairness. About the right to stand in a room and be seen, and about protecting the histories we carry with us. Today's ruling is a step toward making sure no one else has to fight this fight alone." The questions came quickly after that, but she answered them calmly, never losing the thread of what mattered. Behind her, the courthouse loomed tall and solid. A reminder that the decision was now written into the record public, permanent and undeniable. When the reporters finally dispersed, Ava stepped away from the crowd and took a slow breath. Somewhere in the coming days, the desk would come home. But for now, she let herself stand still in the cool air, knowing the real victory wasn't in what she would take back, but in what she had forced them to give up. The desk arrived on a quiet Friday morning, delivered not by movers in a rush, but by a small crew from a local restoration shop Ava trusted. The court's order had made it clear. The desk was to be returned in its original state, with no alterations or improvements from the years it had been in someone else's possession. Even so, Ava had asked the restorers to inspect it before it entered her home, just to be certain nothing had been tampered with during the transfer. When they carried it inside, the weight of it seemed heavier than the polished wood should allow, as though the years of absence had settled in. Its grain. Sunlight from the tall windows of her office stretched across its surface, catching the deep amber sheen and the fine lines of hand-carved detail. The desk had been built to last, its proportions balanced, its joints seamless. Her great-grandfather's craftsmanship lived in every edge and curve, each chisel mark carefully hidden, yet somehow still present in the wood's character. She stood back as the restorers placed it against the wall she had cleared for it, their hands careful as they lowered it into place. Once they were gone, she closed the door and sat in the chair she'd set aside for this moment. Her fingers drifted across the surface, following the subtle undulations left by decades of use. There were faint scratches here, and they're marks of utility, not neglect, and a soft darkening at the edges where hands had rested over time. The hidden compartment was still there, just as she remembered from her childhood stories. She pressed the small release under the lip of the middle drawer, and the false panel eased open. Inside, the initials were still carved, clean and deep into the wood. Etc. Elijah Thomas Carter. She traced them lightly with her fingertip, feeling the grooves as though they were a handshake across generations. It didn't feel like a trophy. It didn't feel like a prize for winning. It felt like a return, a repair of something that had been broken for far too long. This desk had once been in the workshop where her great-grandfather built furniture for neighbors, friends, and customers who valued his skill. It had survived the loss of that shop, the wrongful eviction, the years in storage, and the theft that had sent it into the shadows. And now it stood here again, not in a showroom, not in a stranger's collection, but in her care. Wall, a framed photograph of her great-grandfather at work, seemed to watch over the space. She had hung it there earlier that week, knowing the desk would sit beneath it. In the picture, he was leaning over a plank of wood, his tools neatly arranged. Beside him, a faint smile on his face, as though the work itself was a kind of quiet joy. She imagined him here now, running his palm over the desk, nodding once in approval. The news had already moved on to other stories, but in the industry, the ripples were still spreading. The auctioneer was gone, his license permanently revoked, his name now spoken in low tones as a cautionary tale. The auction house, burdened by fines and legal scrutiny, had shuttered 2 of its locations. Other auctioneers, seeing what had happened, began revisiting their own practices. Some out of conscience, others out of self-preservation. Ava knew the fight wasn't over. The ruling had been a victory, but systemic change didn't happen with a single case. Still, she allowed herself to take in this moment, the desk standing where it belonged, her office filled with the warm, faint scent of old wood and history reclaimed. She opened the top drawer and placed inside a copy of the court's decision, folded neatly in an envelope. It was a reminder not just of what she had fought for, but of why she had refused every offer to settle, every attempt to silence her. When she stepped back from the desk, she realized it looked less like an object and more like a marker in the timeline of her family. A piece of the past anchored in the present, carrying with it the weight of both loss and restoration. For the first time in decades, the craftsmanship of Elijah Thomas Carter was not hidden in a warehouse or locked away in someone else's world. It was here, in the open, where it could be seen, touched, and remembered exactly where it belonged.